Welcome to Episode 4, Part 1 in this series on Title Studio, a powerful and versatile title creation application from Boris FX. In Episode 3, I described Title Studio's user interface in some detail. If you watched that episode, you'll remember that I talked about the tool strip and how it changed contextually, depending upon the object being created. In that episode, I dealt with the creation of a text object, and the tools available in the tool strip reflected that. In this episode, I want to concentrate on shape objects, how they're created, and how they're manipulated. Because the tool strip is contextual, some of the tools available are therefore different to those available in text mode. I need to state now that during this tutorial, I'll be performing actions that result in lists of shape parameters being displayed. Because I don't want to bog you down with countless explanations of parameter functions, I'll just be describing a limited number. I may decide to dedicate more time in future tutorials, but I wanted to get through as much as possible in this one. Please note that I'm using Title Studio within Continuum version 2021.5. Your version's UI may be slightly different. Be aware that some interactions with objects in the workspace can be a bit frustrating. You'll see what I mean by that when they're encountered. Normally, when the advanced UI is launched, it will look like this. I say normally because if the default title font has been changed in a previous session, the font will propagate to this session. Selecting the default preset in the basic UI doesn't do anything though. I want to start with a blank canvas, so as I described in Episode 3, I'll simply click on the top entry in the Timeline Control section and press Delete. Before proceeding, I want to say a few words about the terminology used when talking about shapes. In Title Studio, any shape drawn in the composite window is called Spline Media. The word spline refers to the way the shape is created. Put simply, a spline is a shape that's made up of 3 or more lines referred to as splines, joined together with nodes. Boris FX documentation refers to these nodes as cusp points, or control points if Bezier handles are enabled. Confusingly, the documentation commonly refers to cusp points as control points, so that's something to remember if you consult the documentation. There are 2 types of spline media, one called spline object and the other called spline primitive. A spline object is a free-form shape which can be drawn with either the pen or pencil tool, or by using the rectangle or circle tool. A spline primitive is a regular predefined shape and is created using menu options. I want to start by creating a spline object, in this case a simple shape. But before I do, I want to repeat what I said in Episode 3 about guides. For those who haven't seen Episode 3, guides are horizontal and vertical lines that can be pulled onto the composite display as an aid to the positioning of objects. I want to repeat, it's very important that you don't use guides when working with splines. If you do, the application will crash and you will lose your work. There are 4 ways I can create a spline object, depending upon what I want the shape to be. If I want a regular shape, I can select the rectangle tool or the circle tool in the tool strip. I can then draw a rectangle or a circle in the composite window. When drawing splines using these tools, keyboard modifiers can be used to determine how the shape is drawn. To avoid potentially erratic behavior when using keyboard modifiers, draw the shape at a moderate pace. Don't draw quickly. Holding the Shift key down while using the rectangle tool will create a square, extending from a corner. Holding the Shift and Control keys down creates a square extending from the centre. Holding the Shift key down while using the Circle tool will create a circle instead of the default oval. Holding the Shift and Control keys down while using the Circle tool will create a circle, but the circle will be drawn extending from the centre. I can also use the pencil or pen tool to draw an irregular shape. With the pen tool, each click of the mouse in the composite display creates a cusp point. When 3 points have been created, you'll see that the shape appears to close. This isn't the case. To show this, I'll go to the Fill tab in the Controls window and remove the check mark from the Fill On checkbox. The spline only closes when the first cusp point is clicked. You'll see that as soon as you start creating the spline, the timeline control section will be populated with a number of entries. You will also see that the tool strip changes. I'll deal with these additional tools in the next tutorial. You should note that the entries for a spline object will be different to the entries for a spline primitive. The pencil tool is used to draw the spline freeform, instead of building it up with a series of mouse clicks. You can see that the shape appears to close when I release the mouse. This is only because the Fill On option is checked, and since shapes are normally filled, it's a good idea to leave this option enabled. You will also notice that the shape has a bounding box with sizing handles. Cusp points are created automatically along the periphery. To see these cusp points, ensure that the sizing handles are displayed, then select the pen tool. At this point, I'd just like to say a few words about track structure. The entries in the control section correspond to tracks on the global timeline, and their structure is a bit like the structure of folders in the Windows File Explorer app. The structure is hierarchical, and this hierarchy will determine how changes made to certain track entries will affect other track entries. I'll elaborate on that a little later. Now back to the current track structure. The top entry is the scene container, which contains all the elements of the title. This makes the manipulation of a very complex title very easy. The next entry down is called the shape track and is the primary track for the shape, in this case the spline. All valid elements of the spline are contained within this entry, in this case the texture of the spline and the spline itself. Next comes the texture track. This entry is used to modify the spline's various attributes, such as fill color, border, shadow, etc. The next entry is the track for the basic spline. Selecting this entry displays sizing handles if the arrow tool is selected, or cusp points if the pen tool is selected, allowing spline manipulation using the mouse. I'll now create a spline primitive. There are 4 ways of doing this. Probably the easiest of these is to use the keystroke sequence Ctrl-Alt-A. Another way is to click the Add New Media icon and select Spline Primitive. The third way is to select Track from the menu bar, then New Media and Spline Primitive. Finally, you can right-click anywhere in the timeline window and select New Media, then Spline Primitive. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you will have noticed that there's a slight difference between the shape created with the keyboard shortcut and those created using the other methods. I'll just demonstrate again. You can see that Ctrl-Alt-A creates a rectangle that's plain white. Now I'll create one using the context menu method. You can see that this rectangle appears shaded at the right-hand side. This is because by default the scene entry has an active light. As you can see, the active light is up in the top left-hand corner, so the bottom right-hand corner appears shaded. Now, as you can see, one of the frustrating things about Title Studio is that you must select the correct tool for the job. I was trying to move the light with the pen, and you can't do that. Now if I click on the other rectangle entries, you'll see that they're no longer plain white. They're now showing the lighting effect. In itself it's no big issue, as the workaround is simple, but you need to be aware of it though. I've reported this to Boris FX and they've confirmed it as a bug. They have suggested a workaround for this. For this workaround to work, the Show Materials track setting must be enabled. To do this, select the Show Material Tracks icon in the Timeline Controls section. It will turn blue and a material track entry will be displayed. Under this will be a shader track entry. Select this entry. In the Controls window, you'll see a Material Attributes tab and a Type parameter with a drop-down arrow. Click the arrow and select Texture from the list. The spline will now show the lighting. As I mentioned earlier, a spline primitive is basically a spline object, but its shape is predefined. The default shape is a rectangle and is placed at the center of the display. The shape can be changed to one of a number of predefined shapes, as you'll see shortly. You'll notice that, unlike when a spline object is created, the toolbar doesn't change. That's because a spline primitive can't be modified using the pen tool. To do this, the spline primitive must be converted into a spline object. I'll show how to do this shortly. You may also notice that the track entries are different, reflecting the difference in the spline. The spline primitive can be modified, but only in a limited number of ways. Selecting the shape entry, in this case the rectangle entry, allows this modification. The Controls window reveals tabs for all the attributes that can be modified. I'm not going to deal with these in this tutorial, most are self-explanatory, but feel free to play around with them to get a feel of their individual functions. Here's a tip though, if you do feel like making changes. If you get totally unstuck and want to revert back to default, simply double-click on the interpolation boxes that show horizontal dotted lines and those parameters will be reset. A spline primitive's predefined shape can also be changed. Clicking on the Material Texture entry reveals a list of alternative shapes in the Shape tab of the Controls window. Clicking on a shape icon will convert the shape accordingly. At the side of each selected shape icon, there's a list of shape parameters that can be changed. This list is contextual and, as such, changes depending upon the shape selected. As I mentioned in the introduction, for the sake of time constraints, I need to minimize my descriptions of various parameters. Having said that, I'll select each shape in turn and pick out one or two parameters for each shape. Firstly, the default rectangular shape. The parameters for this shape are pretty straightforward, but I'll just mention two of them. Corner size when changed creates rounded corners on the rectangle. Corner type is self-evident and displays a list of three types of corner: convex, concave or straight. Next comes the wedge shape spline. There's only two parameters for this shape. Start angle determines where the wedge starts, 0 degrees being vertical. Arc angle determines the angle of the resultant arc. The oval shape spline has no parameters. The arrow shape spline has just one parameter. Use this to change the direction of the arrow. Next comes the star shape spline. The two parameters here determine how many points the star has, up to a maximum of 200, and the length of the points. The point length maximum is 100. The next predefined shape is the medallion. This basically is similar to the star shape, but is elongated and has some short points. It has the same parameters as the star shape, and these are shared with the star shape. The next one is the heart. The roundness parameter simply changes the shape of the heart. The next shape is a bit of an enigma. It's a grid. I'm not sure why you'd want to create a spline in the form of a grid, but it's there if you need to. Chances are, like this, you won't see a grid. If you don't, you need to select the Fill tab and make sure that the Fill On checkbox is unchecked. Next, go to the Border tab, select one of the border checkboxes and then change the edge colour to a different colour than the background colour. The final shape is a line. The parameters determine where on the display the line starts and ends. As with the grid shape, fills should be disabled. Borders should be enabled with the colour contrasting to the background colour. A spline primitive can be changed further, but to do this it needs to be converted into a spline object. This is achieved by clicking on the shader texture entry in the timeline control section, clicking on the Change Track Media icon and selecting Spline Object from the list that appears. You'll see that the track entries have now changed, indicating that it's changed into a spline object. Now select the Material Texture track. You will see that the toolbar has changed and the hollow arrow tools should be highlighted. If it isn't, select it and click anywhere on the spline's periphery. Don't forget that the periphery has to be yellow before you click. You should now see the sizing handle. Now select the pen tool and the cusp point should appear. Spline parameters such as location and size can be adjusted in one of three ways. They can be manipulated directly using the sizing handles at spline texture level. They can also be manipulated at spline track level directly using the red, green and blue arrows, or manipulated indirectly using parameters in the controls window. Before describing the methods of spline manipulation, it's important to understand the differences between these methods and how the spline is affected. When manipulated at spline level, that's when the spline texture entry is selected in the timeline controls section. The position of the spline is absolute. In other words, its position is fixed in the display, unless of course it's subsequently changed at spline texture level. When manipulated at spline track level, the resulting spline parameters are all relative to the spline at spline texture level. This is a little tricky to get your brain around, so I'll give you an example. Using the spline already created, I'll make some changes to its location at spline track level. For simplicity, I'll just change its horizontal position. Now I'll return to the spline texture level. As you can see, there are two rectangles. One is the spline at its new location, and the other is a red outline at its original location. Now, if I move the mouse to the red outline until it turns yellow, I can click on it and move it and the spline follows it. It maintains its relative position to the original spline position. Similarly, if I change the scale of the bounding box, the spline changes accordingly. Conversely, if I go back to spline track level and change the scale parameter, then go back to spline texture level, the original spline parameters remain unchanged. So back to spline manipulation. With the spline texture track selected and the arrow tool selected, you should see that the spline bounding box has 8 handles. Click on the spline outline when it turns yellow to show the handles if not already showing. To move the spline, hover the mouse over any part of the bounding box periphery, excepting the handles. Left click and drag. If the spline is quite small, this can be a little tricky, so it's advisable to zoom in to make adjustments. To scale the spline, left-click one of the handles and drag. Dragging the vertical midpoint handles will scale in the X direction. Dragging the horizontal midpoint handles will scale in the Y direction. Dragging a corner handle will scale in both directions. Now you remember in the introduction I said that there are some interactions with objects that can be frustrating. Well, this is one of them and ranks pretty high in the frustration league. Moving or sizing an object using the bounding box is a little tricky. The way handles change how a spline is scaled can be changed by using keyboard modifiers. Holding Shift down will scale the object proportionally around the center. Holding Control down while dragging a cone handle will rotate the object. Holding Control down while dragging a midpoint handle will skew the object. I'm going to have to finish there. I had hoped to complete the subject of spline creation and manipulation, but clearly there's more to it than I anticipated. Still, I hope I've given you enough to be going on with. In part 2, I'll show how spline objects can be modified. I'll also deal with the tricky subject of Bezier and tangent handles. I'll show how the grid can help to position splines accurately. Finally, if time permits, I'll create a lower third consisting of a spline and a text object. As always, thanks for sticking with me to the end. I hope you found it useful. If you have, please consider subscribing and join me for part 2. Until then, bye for now.